In the 1990s, there was a growing fear among psychologists that people who were allegedly abducted by UFOs were gathering in support groups. The concern was that by hearing other people's stories and meeting them in person, it would reinforce their beliefs and make it harder to work through their delusions in therapy. And today, anyone can log onto a forum and meet hundreds of people who share your beliefs, regardless of what those beliefs are. Not to mention the sensationalist media and documentaries that channels like the Discovery Channel or Fox News air regularly to reinforce these beliefs. This happens to social groups of all kinds, including furries. Social snowballing is culturally effed. Hey there, I'm RK, and for about 2 years, I lived in a house full of furries. Many of my friends right now live in houses full of furries. You know what's culturally effed? That. Today, we're gonna look at gatherings. Why do people go to conventions, and why on earth did we move in together? Firstly, I want to talk about conventions and convention culture. Conventions as we know them today originated in 1936 and 37, where two groups of British and American gentlemen simultaneously got the idea to host a planned event in a public venue to celebrate science fiction. These were the first sci-fi cons ever. Eventually, they grew to include fantasy and horror genres as well. The first official science fiction convention was held in New Jersey in 1938 and attracted around 100 people, including the first cosplayers. As this concept got more popular, it branched out to other media such as comic books, and for other purposes entirely, such as industry gatherings in all different professional sectors. This culminated in WorldCon, the largest science fiction convention. The mentality up until the 1970s and 80s was to discourage small and local meets to make WorldCon the singular destination across the world. This was a place to get autographs, buy merchandise, social with fellow nerds, hotels, drinking, costumes, you know. As the convention was getting too big to handle, it divided up into Fantasy WorldCon, Horror WorldCon, and Comic-Con. Local conventions still managed to spring up here and there, but not without flack from the big league. The first manga and anime convention was held in Japan in 1975 and was brought overseas to the West through conventions like WorldCon in the 1980s, introducing this aspect of Japanese culture to mainstream Western society. It was during this time that the grand society of World Cons were becoming a little more easygoing about local cons, since the fandoms were growing so large and self-sufficient. These new small local cons were no longer any threat. I know what you're thinking. What the hell does this have to do with furries? Well, fans of funny animals were attending these conferences and were beginning to notice each other by the 80s. Fantasy and cartoon conventions came along featuring anime and funny animal cartoons, sort of a cousin to these sci-fi cons we've been talking about. They often attracted the same kind of people. This would bring them together at hotel room parties where they would drink and wear costumes and socialize, you know. But in a drama-fueled twist, which we're not going to get into, this group of friends with common interests were ostracized from the general crowd and were being bullied out of these con spaces. Remember that this was a time that online bullying was also starting to affect furries, so there was already a stigma attached to the fandom that was bleeding into real life. It only took so many straws before the camel's back broke. The furries decided to start their own convention. And so, in 1989, Conference Zero opened its doors to the public in California, and the fandom grew steadily from a mere 60 attendees to its peak in 1998 at 1,200 attendees. By the 2000s, furry convention attendance skyrocketed, some cities experiencing double their attendance as usual. Anthrocon, the current largest convention, attracted around 6,000 attendees in 2014. Eurofurence, the largest European convention, attracted about 2,000 attendees. Furries join the fandom in what we call media waves, in which fans of a certain media, like anime or comics like Ninja Turtles, video games like Sonic the Hedgehog, or animations like The Lion King or My Little Pony. Fans of these joined the furry fandom in big influxes. People were also coming in from the internet, having discovered the fandom in chat rooms and forums and weren't necessarily fans of a specific franchise. The electronic furry fandom was the first of such media waves, and one that has never actually stopped. Typically, when a new media wave comes along, everyone freaks the fuck out because there's a new and a different thing, and these people are excited about it. That's when people say things like, bronies aren't real furries, they're weird and gross, or LARPers aren't real furries, they get too much exercise. It's ultimately pointless, and everyone moves on with their lives when it becomes less of a big deal. It's okay to like things. You can have your cake and eat it too, but if the person next to you has a different kind of cake, you don't need to slap it out of their hands shouting, "That's not cake!" I think it's more about a fear of change.
We fear change.
But if things didn't change and new things weren't introduced to the fandom, it would become stagnant and boring. So that's the how and the why we go to nerd conventions. But the other thing I want to talk about is furry cohabitation. After what we've just learned about conventions and room parties, it's not hard to imagine how a house of furries might come to be. So let's say you make a lot of friends online and they're all going to a big convention in the nearby big city, and you really want to go too. Maybe you'll meet some of them and make those relationships a little bit more real and tangible. Next thing you know, it's no longer this weird thing you do on the internet. It suddenly becomes a weird thing in real life. No longer limited to evenings and weekends logged into a chat room. Now it's all of the time and in your living room. You know a bunch of new people in your hometown with the same hobby and interests as you, and next thing you know, one of you needs a roommate. And then bam, you got yourself a furry house. Now, this doesn't sound particularly remarkable, but to me it is, because where I live here in Toronto, there are a large number of all furry houses peppered across the city. And that's culturally effed. That's effed up, guys. Some of them are roommate collectives of 3 or more furries who all met each other either online or at conventions, or they're couples living together who met through the fandom. At the top of the show, I mentioned that I used to live with furries. I used to live with a cat, a bunny, and a lemur, then a fox moved in. Then briefly we hosted a sheep and a different kind of cat. At the time of this recording, I currently live with 2 fur-friendly but not furry humans who only bite if I forget to feed them. People choose to live together or near each other for a lot of different reasons. When they do, they create a safe space. It creates an environment for people to be themselves and to shed the performance of living in the regular world. They become more open and honest and let more of themselves out. This is how we get gay villages like the Castro district in San Francisco or the Church and Wellesley village in Toronto. Whenever I ask people the question, "What do you do to be furry?" almost always the response is the same. I hang out with friends who are also furries. Of course, the other common responses are either 1, they go to furry conventions, or 2, they look at furry porn. So since this is the case, we can conclude that furry is first and foremost a social group. It's a gathering spot for people to meet, celebrate our common interests, exchange ideas, consume alcohol, form lifelong friendships, and even romance. In the past episode of Culturally Effed on the Internet, I talked about the formation of the furry identity and the persona, but that's only part of the fandom. The other part is this social aspect. The fact that we can rely on each other for company and friendship in a very real way. Conventions give us a public venue to meet new furries and absorb new furry media created by other furries. It allows us to celebrate our effed hobby with other people, dressing in our effed costumes, drawing our effed pictures, reading our effed stories, and meeting our effed selves. To me, this is what defines being culturally effed, assuming, of course, effed stands for furry. What do you do to be furry? I really want to know, so please post your response in the comments section below. Culturally Effed this week was brought to you by Howl, the monthly furry dance party in Toronto. If it weren't for Howl, I would have never met the co-conspirator Underbite Dragon. It was also brought to you by these good friends. If you like what we do here, please hit like and subscribe to let us know that you want more Culturally Effed. If you have an idea for a future episode, tweet at us at Culturally Effed, that's culturally_FD. Or you could write on our Facebook walls or one of our many other walls on the internet. This week, we talked about furry as a social movement and how we grew to be a community in part by the popularization of convention culture. Next week, we look at the kinds of things people buy at these conventions and within the fandom itself. we'll be looking at furry economics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.